Chapter 304. Dean slightly frowned and sneered. The Melon Consortium doesn't dare to attack the architect of the Temple of Elements. They want to use this roundabout way to weaken my prestige and influence in the aristocracy. They want to take advantage of the long-time rejection and disgust of hunters by the aristocracy. Yes. Old Foulin nodded. So we can't let them succeed. You will stay in the Temple of Elements and fight back against them. Dean shook his head. I don't have time to stay in the temple. But I have to go back to the Temple of Elements to buy some materials. I can solve this matter on the way. Old Foulin looked at him for a moment. All right, you handle this matter yourself. Dean nodded and got up. It's getting late. I'll go back first. If the temple comes to investigate, tell them that I've been here. All right, I'll handle this matter. Old Foulin agreed. Dean left the main entrance of the Ryan Castle under the escort of Old Foulin and Sandro. His sudden appearance surprised the other members and servants of the castle. They didn't know when the young man had appeared in the castle. It was curfew time when he returned to the yard town. But Dean was sitting in the carriage of the Ryan family. He was unimpeded all the way. After a few hours, he returned to his castle by the Mosa River. There was a faint light on the second floor of the castle. Apparently there were people who hadn't slept yet. There was a trace of coldness in Dean's eyes. The carriage stopped and he got off. 2 knights from the Ryan family recognized Dean. They didn't expect that the young master would come back late at night. They were surprised and quickly came forward to greet him. They opened the door of the castle for him. Dean entered the castle and opened the door of the hall. He saw that there were 2 oil lamps in the hall. The light was weak, and there was no one in the empty hall. He sat down at the table and looked at the guard. Call the butler and Ollie from the kitchen. The guard was nervous as he saw Dean's face. He replied, Yes. After he finished speaking, he quickly ran up the stairs. A moment later, a series of hurried footsteps came from the second floor. The guard and Nicholas rushed over one after the other. Nicholas was standing on the second floor's handrail when he saw the familiar figure sitting in the hall. His expression changed slightly, but in the next moment, he put on a surprised smile and hurried forward, saying, Young master, you're back? Duddian glanced at him but didn't care about the surprise on his face. He coldly said, Make me tea. Nicholas answered, Yes. He picked up the teapot and poured a cup of tea for Dean. Dean glanced at the tea and coldly said, There is no heat at all. How can this be called tea? Nicotine's expression changed slightly, but he quickly revealed an apologetic expression and said, It's this little one's fault. I'll go boil some water for you. After he finished speaking, he turned around and ran into the kitchen, just in time to run into the chef Ollie, who came out from another side room. His face immediately became serious, and he shouted, Quickly go boil water, the young master is back, what are you dawdling for? After boiling water, cook some of the young master's favorite snow rabbit rib. The chef, Ollie, was a middle-aged man in his 30s. He had just been woken up from his sleep. Hearing the young master calling him, he put on his clothes and hurried over. When he heard Nicotine's words, he was startled for a moment, then he quickly agreed and turned around to go to the kitchen. Ollie, come here. Duddian called out. Ollie was startled. He immediately stopped and looked at Nicotine. He quickly bypassed him and came to stand in front of Dean. Master, what do you want me to do? Dean didn't reply to him but turned to Nicotine. You go boil the water. I have something to do with Ollie. Nicotine's face slightly changed. He forced a smile. Yes. He turned and walked into the kitchen. Nicotine boiled the water after a while. Fortunately, he had been a butler since childhood, so he was very familiar with the work of the servants. Soon he returned to the hall with a pot of boiling water. The hall was dead silent. Alan was standing in front of Dean. Dean was sitting at the table. His fingers were gently tapping on the table. His face was calm and unfathomable. He felt a chill in his heart and smiled. Young master, the water is here. Dean nodded. Put it here. Go and call the others. Now? Nicotine was startled. Duddian looked at him and indifferently said, Why? Is it late? Nicholas quickly said, Not late, not late, I'll go now. Finished speaking, he quickly went upstairs. After a moment, Sergei, Gwyneth and Jean came down from upstairs. They saw Dean sitting in the hall. Sergei and Gwyneth looked at each other. They saw the meaning in each other's eyes as they went down the stairs. Jean was the first to go downstairs. He was still wearing his pajamas. He looked at Dean in surprise. You finally came back. We thought. Suddenly he thought of something. He looked around and his face turned ugly. Old hay. Dean looked at him and whispered, I tried my best. He was unlucky. Jin's eyes turned red. I don't blame you. It's just that his body, Dean was silent. There is no way to bring it back. Old Jean clenched his fists and lowered his head. It's all my fault. I'm too weak. If I was stronger like Sergei, maybe I could have killed that thing. Dean looked at him but didn't say anything. He turned to look at Sergei and Gwyneth. Sergei smiled as he saw Duddian. I didn't expect you to be so lucky. We thought that you were taken away by a monster. We waited for you at the entrance for 3 days but didn't see you come back. It's reasonable to say that your chances of survival are slim. But your luck is good. Dean stared at him. I heard that the patriarch of the Ryan family asked you to go outside the giant wall to find me. Why didn't you go? Sergei shrugged his shoulders and said, We don't know where you went. How can we search for you? I don't have a perception ability. You can't blame me. Gwyneth, who was next to him, said, My magic marks ability doesn't have a perception ability. So there is no way to find you. Liar. At this time, Jean, who was standing in front of Dean, looked up and angrily said, I was going to go but you two stopped me. You said that if Dean died then we would be free. Sergei's face slightly changed as he coldly said, Don't slander me. You need evidence. Yes. Gwyneth's eyes were cold as she stared at Jean. Dean slightly raised his hand to interrupt Jean, who was about to continue to argue. I know what you are thinking. I don't care what you think in your heart. But at least let me see your loyalty. Speaking up to here, he looked at Sergei and Gwyneth. Do you really think that if I die you will be free? I'm sorry to tell you that if I die then the umbrella over your head will be gone. You will die a more ugly death than me. You won't be imprisoned again. Sergei and Gwyneth's face slightly changed. Sergei opened his mouth. He is lying. We didn't. Dean raised his hand to interrupt him. I don't ask you to search for me outside the giant wall, but you should at least wait for me to come back. Maybe I will be dying when I return to the entrance of the giant wall. Wouldn't you be able to save my life if you were there? Sergei was startled and speechless for a moment. Dean softly said, I said that I will give each of you 3 chances. Sergei, you have used up 2 of them. I hope that you are on your own. Sergei's face slightly changed as he turned his head. Dean didn't pay attention to his attitude. His eyes fell on Nicholas, who was always respectful. Butler. I'm here. Nicholas quickly replied. Do you know that you have used up all 3 chances? Dean narrowed his eyes. There was a hint of killing intent in his voice. Young master, I don't understand. I remember that I offended you in the carriage on the way back. Now that I'm in your castle, I've always behaved myself. You can't misunderstand me because of my past actions. In front of you, I don't have the ability to turn over a new leaf. I've long since given up. Moreover, I'm already so old. Nicholas hurriedly tried to explain. Dean shook his head. I said that you have to listen to me and be loyal to me from the time I bailed you out. You can't have any bad intentions. Even if you have bad intentions, you can only think about it in your heart. Even if you do, then don't let me know. Unfortunately, your ability is too rough. To be honest, I'm very disappointed. I'm not disappointed that you betrayed me, but the process of betrayal. There are too many loopholes. It's hard to imagine how careless your previous master must have been to allow you to empty their treasury. Perhaps I've misjudged you. Nicholas was startled. Sergei and Gwyneth tilted their heads and looked at him. Sergei had a gloating smile on his face. He folded his arms and quietly watched the fight. This lowly one doesn't understand. Please speak frankly, young master. Nicotine came back to his senses and said firmly. Dean indifferently said, Why did you entrust the chef to inquire about my identity? What is your intention? Nicholas couldn't help but look at the chef. Master, he is slandering me. Dean glanced at him. Do you think that money can seal your mouth? Indeed, money is very useful in some cases. Unfortunately, you can only give him money. I can give him more money than you can give him. I can also give him life. Tell me, who's more important, your identity or my identity? I think that even a pig would know which side to stand on. Nicotine's expression immediately turned ugly. He lowered his head and said, Young master, I know I was wrong. I just wanted to serve you better. You don't have to say these words. Dean indifferently said, The third betrayal was when you searched for my things in my room. The fourth betrayal was when you secretly sent a letter to the Melon Consortium to inform me that I was going to hunt outside the giant wall. Nicholas hurriedly said, It wasn't me. It really wasn't me. You can't slander me like that. Dean indifferently looked at him. You should be glad that I'm very busy right now. I don't have time to deal with you. I've said that I'll make those who betray me cry. Since you're restless at home, then the next time we go hunting, you will come with me. Nicotine's expression changed as he hastily said, Young master, you can't do this to me. I can't accept this. I like to make people unwilling. Master, Dean raised his hand to interrupt him. He waved for Alan to retreat. He glanced at Sergei and Gwyneth. You should also get ready and have a good rest. We will go outside the giant wall in 2 days. He turned to Jean. You stay at home and hire a few servants. Remember to pick carefully. Don't let other consortiums get the news and take the opportunity to send people in. Chapter 305. Dean looked at Nicholas. Bring me the newspapers of the past few days. Yes. Nicholas bowed his head and left in low spirit. After a moment, Nicholas took out a thick stack of newspapers and piled them on the table in front of Dean. Nicholas secretly glanced at Dean's expression. He couldn't see whether he was happy or angry. He forced a smile. Master, these are the newspapers from the day you left until this morning. You just came back from the prison, so you haven't eaten yet. Should I get you something to eat first? No, I came back a long time ago. I just had dinner at the Ryan family. Dean indifferently said. Nicholas's eyes lit up. Master, why didn't you contact us when you came back? We could have gone to the cleaners to pick you up. Dean glanced at him. Do I need to tell you about my actions? If I didn't care about your bail money and didn't want to bring back a waste, you wouldn't be able to speak now. Do you know that? Nicholas's face changed. He didn't dare to probe anymore. Go and rest. Dean took the newspapers and went back to his room. He read the newspapers in turn. There weren't many changes in the military. Barbarians had attacked several fortresses, but there wasn't a large-scale war. As for the financial groups, all of them were developing their main industries and consolidating their business dynasties. In addition to consolidating their businesses, they also allocated a portion of their resources to the military. Clearly, they were taking advantage of the current chaotic period of war and wanted to use military supplies to make some extra money. There wasn't much movement from the Temple of Elements, but on the way there was a sensational theory published by the lightning master Ivissa. Bioelectricity. There is the power of thunder in the body of a living creature. This must be the wealth of the god of light. If it can be guided, then it will produce a huge amount of power. Dean sneered as he glanced at the paper and the comments of all parties. The biomagnetic field had a great effect, but it needed to be used with the help of very advanced equipment. Moreover, it was far from what was written in the paper. We haven't entered the microscopic level yet. We haven't entered the microscopic level yet, so we don't know about electrons and molecules, which are the components of the world. The road to the future is very long. If we want to conquer the monsters outside the giant wall and step out of the giant wall, then we must have the power to sweep away the monsters. But this power is not something that can be achieved by relying on human strength. Even if we evolve to the extreme, we can be comparable to the monsters, but only a few individuals. Father said that technology belongs to the masses and will always serve the masses. Only when the masses have the power to hunt the monsters can we sweep away the monsters. Dean's eyes lit up as he put away the newspaper. Dean sat on the chair and pondered for a moment. He went to the wardrobe and opened the secret compartment. He pulled out a brick from the back of the secret compartment. There was a very small, C-shaped groove on the inside of the brick. He gently twisted the handle, and the wall next to him slowly rotated. A small dark compartment appeared. The space was very small, no more than 2 cubic meters. The super chip and the card reader were wrapped in different cloth. Even if someone found them, they wouldn't know how to use them. The card reader had fingerprint recognition. Dean took it out and sat on the bed to read the knowledge inside. The night passed. Dean put the card reader and the super chip back into the dark compartment. He also put the book he brought back into the dark compartment. He changed into clean clothes and went downstairs. He looked at Nicholas, who was waiting for him in the hall. "Prepare the car and pack breakfast. I'll eat on the road." Nicholas was startled. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to the temple." Dean looked at him and indifferently said, "Oh, master, wait a moment. I'll go and prepare everything for you." Nicholas nodded and turned around to prepare. His humble expression quickly darkened, and a trace of disappointment flashed in his eyes. "Tell Sergey to go to the place where I bought steel last time and order another batch of steel. The quantity will be the same as last time." Dean took the breakfast and went out. He looked back at Nicholas. "If the steel doesn't arrive before I come back, then you and Sergey will be responsible for it." "Yes." Nicholas smiled. The carriage slowly moved away. Dean lifted the curtain. "Hurry up! Change the flag of the temple." The coachman was surprised but quickly complied. He inserted the flag of the temple on the carriage. He whipped the horses and galloped away. After a moment, Dean arrived at the foot of the mountain where the headquarters of the Temple of Elements was located. The carriage went straight to the front of the temple under Dean's command. Dean jumped out of the carriage and glanced at the temple. Although it was early, but it was already 8 o'clock when he arrived. Many architects who lived in the headquarters of the temple had woken up and started to work. More than a dozen figures could be seen in the hall of the temple. Dean followed the stairs into the temple. He glanced around and found the trading desk. He quickly walked towards it. "Hello, what can I do for you?" There was a pretty girl behind the trading desk. She was holding a book called Basic Metal Theory Encyclopedia in her hand. She felt that someone was coming over. She looked up and saw the intermediate architect medal pinned on Dean's chest. There was a trace of polite smile on her face as she casually asked. Dean noticed that she also had a medal on her chest. It was an intermediate medal. He was surprised as the girl's age was almost the same as his. He didn't expect that she would be an intermediate architect. This shock only lasted for a moment. He quickly asked, "Is there a cage that's harder than the others?" The girl slightly frowned. "We only sell items here. If you want to buy a cage, you can go outside and buy it. There are a lot of them in the military." "I want a very strong cage. An ordinary cage won't do." "What is the hardest metal you have here?" Dean asked. The girl indifferently replied, "We don't have a cage, but the hardest metal we have is tungsten steel. It is a kind of alloy. You can entrust a metal architect to build a cage for you or entrust me. Of course there will be a lot of fees." "Tungsten steel?" Dean was startled. He didn't expect that the alchemy department would be able to refine tungsten steel. The last time he reminded Nightingale about aluminum alloy, The concept of alloy didn't appear in metal smelting at that time. If the concept of alloy was developed after the introduction of Nightingale's alloy products into the market, then in just a few years they had smelted tungsten steel. Such development was simply amazing. Alright, tungsten steel. Dean decided that the cage made of tungsten steel wouldn't be able to break free from the strength of the small splitter. If the cage was big enough and the steel pipe was thick enough, then even the great splitter wouldn't be able to break free. Chapter 306. How much is the price? Dudian asked. The girl's tone was cold as she saw that Dudian didn't know. Tungsten steel is a commercial invention. You can buy it with points or gold coins. If you buy it with points, then it will be 10 kilograms. If you buy it with gold coins, then it will be 7 gold coins for 10 kilograms. If you don't buy it, then it will be 10 gold coins for 10 kilograms. You are an intermediate architect, so I will give you a 30% discount. If you are a senior architect, then 50% discount. Dudian was a bit surprised. 10 gold coins for 10 kilograms? This tungsten steel is almost the same price as copper coins. Of course, it is a precious metal alloy, so it is as expensive as copper coins. The girl's expression became indifferent as she saw his reaction. Please leave if you don't want to buy it. Dudian pondered. The price of metals in this world was generally more valuable than the metals in the old era. The first reason was that the refining process was very basic, which led to the scarcity of metals. The second reason was that the war outside the fortress and the hunting outside the giant wall required top-grade steel to make weapons and armors. This had greatly increased the price of top-grade steel. I'll buy it. Give me 2,000 kilograms first, Dudian said to the girl after thinking for a moment. The girl who sat back on the chair was surprised. She looked up at Dudian and saw the serious look on the boy's face. She got up again and frowned. 2,000 kilograms? Do you want to buy it with points or gold coins? Gold coins, Dudian replied. He had accumulated enough points to get a senior architect medal after the emergence of the military crossbow. He didn't want to waste them here. There was a trace of relief in the girl's eyes as she indifferently said, Gold coins are limited to 1,000 kilograms per person per day. There is no limit for points. Dudian was surprised. The next moment he understood that the temple had such a system. It was to prevent the temple's personnel from colluding with wealthy businessmen outside to sell the temple's goods at a discounted price. All right, 1,000 kilograms. Dean agreed. He was going to look for Bernard and ask him to help him buy 1,000 kilograms. The girl looked at him. Pay the money first. I'll submit your exchange order. Fill in the address and someone will help you send it to your place. All right. Dean pulled out the wallet sewn from the leather armor and took out 7 gold notes. The words 100 were engraved on them. All of them were 100-digit gold coins. The girl casually glanced at it, and suddenly her eyes widened. Her breathing became a little short. She could not help but ask, What is that? She raised her hand and pointed to a silver coin in Dudian's wallet. Dean was surprised. He took out the epoch medal and put it into his pocket. Nothing. He put the wallet into his pocket. The girl had already seen it when he took it out. Her eyes widened and she looked at the boy in front of her in shock. Her brain was buzzing, and several pieces of information were quickly put together in her mind. Would attribute intermediate oracle, the youngest in history. She took a deep breath and looked up and down at Dean. Are you Mr. Dean? There was a trace of helplessness in Dean's heart. He was in a hurry and didn't want to be entangled. He took out the order in front of her and wrote his name and the location of his castle. He handed the order to her. I am in urgent need of this batch of things. Please help me deliver it quickly. The girl's eyes moved down to the order. She saw the name on the signature of the order. She was pleasantly surprised. Mr. Dean, I didn't recognize you before. I'm sorry. You are the winner of the epoch medal. You can enjoy the same treatment as the masters. You only need to pay a 10% discount. She took out 6 gold notes and handed them back to Dean. Dean didn't expect the epic medal to have such benefit. Although hundreds of gold coins were a trivial matter for him, he took them and asked, "Can I buy 2,000 kilograms at a time?" "Yes, of course," the girl quickly said. "You can enjoy the same treatment as the masters in this regard. The upper limit is 10,000 kilograms. Dean smiled. "Then give me 10,000 kilograms. Then he took out his wallet and took out 3 gold notes. He handed them to her along with the other 6 in his hand. The girl was stunned as she looked at the gold notes. She wasn't surprised by the amount of money. She didn't expect that Dean, who was a wood element architect, would buy 10,000 kilograms of tungsten steel. She couldn't help but ask, "Mr. Dean, are you buying so much tungsten steel for research?" She thought that Dean was an architect who was helping rich businessmen to resell their tungsten steel. She had seen a lot of architects like Dean. Most of the architects in the temple were from middle-class families in the commercial district. They weren't rich, but they weren't poor either. There was no problem for them to go to school. But to step into the field of research would require a lot of money. But for people like Dean, she believed that he wouldn't be short of money. He was richer than 10 rich businessmen. The price of a military crossbow could make a group of nobles jealous. Dean vaguely replied, "Almost." The girl couldn't help but ask, "Are you going to join us?" Dean replied, "We will talk about this later. I hope you can help me deliver the tungsten steel as soon as possible." "Thank you." The girl's eyes flashed with a hint of intelligence. "You said you wanted to use tungsten steel to make a cage, right? Why don't I help you? I can be your assistant." If it was before, she would have directly recommended Dean to build it. But now she knew Dean's identity and thought that he wanted to build a unique cage. So she was willing to join as an assistant. She could take the opportunity to observe Dean's experiment. After all, Dean's military crossbow wasn't only about wood element but also about metal elements such as the weight of the arrowhead, structure, and so on. Dean thought for a moment. "All right, but I don't have a forging furnace." "It's okay. I have one," the girl said. "You can go to my room to build." Dean thought for a moment. "All right then, I'll trouble you. I'll pay for it." He could see that the girl had come here as a part-time job. He estimated that she was in a financial situation. The girl replied, "No need. I'm just an assistant. It's rare for me to watch you try out your new invention. How can I dare to ask for money?" "It's nothing," Dean casually replied. He didn't want to owe a favor as it was the most difficult thing to return. The girl no longer refused. In fact, she was short of money. Suddenly a surprised voice echoed from the side. The girl and Dean looked at the direction of the voice. The girl was curious while Dean knew that the voice was directed at him. 3 people slowly walked over. The one in the lead was a handsome young man with blonde hair and blue eyes. His beautiful golden hair showed his identity, a nobleman. Behind this young man were 2 other young men. One of them was older, about 27 or 28 years old, and had a gentle appearance. The other had a face full of smiles, and it was obvious that he was a mischievous person. Both of them had brown hair, and they were most likely commoners. "Isn't this Dean?" The blond youth came over with a surprised look on his face. Dean glanced at him and felt that there was a hidden knife in his smile. There was a trace of malicious intent in his eyes. As a person who could get along with an old fox like Old Foulin, his ability to read people wasn't comparable to his peers. Dean glanced at the other's robe. There was an orchid pattern on it. Was he from the Milan family? Dean's eyes lit up as he smiled. "Hello. Like I said, Mr. Dew is different from other geniuses. He is not the kind of person who becomes arrogant and complacent just because he has some achievement. Those people in the newspaper are too irresponsible." The blond young man was flattered and said humbly. Dudian smiled. In the end, he was from an aristocratic family. His skills were more ruthless than flattery. Since he knew that he wasn't that kind of person, but he still put forward those commendatory words. The purpose was obvious. If it was someone else, he could listen to it. But the Milan family was the mainstay of the Mel consortium. It was impossible that they didn't know the relationship with him. There are always some people in this world who like to say irresponsible words. After all, the pain isn't on them. Dean faintly smiled. The blond youth nodded. Yes, they won't say such useless words when the pain is on them. Dean shook his head. They will say things like, "Please let me go." Chapter 307. Mr. Dean is really humorous. The blond youth laughed twice. I heard that Mr. Dean is not only an architect but also a hunter. His rank is the same as an architect's, intermediate rank. Mr. Dean is really a genius. You have 2 jobs but you still have outstanding achievement. You must have had a great harvest when you went hunting outside the giant wall, right? Hunter? The girl next to him was startled. She looked up and down at Dean. There was tension and scruples on her face. Dean faintly looked at the youth. Who told you that I went outside the giant wall? The blond youth laughed. I read it in the newspaper. It seems that it was misinformation. Newspapers are getting more and more unprofessional. It's not that the newspaper is unprofessional, but there are too many fools. Dean said in an indifferent tone. There is an old saying that rumors stop with the wise. I believe that you should have heard of it. After all, your Milan family is a great aristocratic family. Everyone in the family is a good person. You should understand this shallow knowledge. The blond youth's face slightly changed. Yes, you are right. I didn't teach you a lesson. Dean indifferently smiled. It was just an exchange. How can you say that I am teaching you a lesson? The blond youth's expression changed. He lowered his head and said, You're right. I misunderstood. It's easy for you to misunderstand things. The newspaper misunderstood me. You misunderstood me when I communicated with you. It's easy to make mistakes and offend people. If it's spread out, people will laugh at you. Fortunately, you met me today. I'm very tight-lipped and will never spread it. Dean coldly said. The golden-haired youth's expression changed slightly. He forced a smile and said, Thank you. Dean didn't look at the blond youth as he looked at the girl. When will the materials arrive? The girl responded, It will take at least 2 hours. All right, let's go to your room and prepare the tools. Is that okay? Dean asked. He was very anxious about this matter. The longer the splitter was, the more likely it would stir up trouble and be arrested by the Holy Church. All right, I have no problem. The girl immediately replied. The blond youth's eyes flashed as he heard their words. There was a look of surprise on his face. Mr. Dean, are you going to make an invention? I didn't see your shadow in the temple, so I thought you went outside the giant wall. Dean indifferently said, You don't have to repeatedly mention the Great Wall. Do you think I would go there with my identity? Are you trying to humiliate me? The golden-haired youth didn't expect this youth to be so sharp with his words. His expression changed as he said, I don't dare. I didn't mean to offend you. Please forgive me. Dean said to the girl, Lead the way. Well, please wait a moment. I'll send your order to the higher-ups first. She turned around and ran into the room behind the trading desk. Not long after, she returned with a mediocre-looking young man. I'm leaving. I'll leave this place to you. The girl giggled at the young man. The young man said blankly, All right. The girl came in front of Dean. Shall we go? Dean nodded and motioned her to lead the way. The blond youth saw that Dean completely ignored him. There was a trace of anger in his eyes, but he tried to restrain himself. After the blond youth left the temple with the girl, he put away the modest smile on his face. His face was expressionless as he clenched his fists in his sleeves. Master Kedden, should we find someone to teach him a lesson? Break one of his arms while no one is around. A brown-haired youth whispered in the youth's ear. The blond youth looked at him and said in a cold voice, Didn't you hear what I just said? This kid is not only an architect but also an intermediate hunter. You want to find someone to teach him a lesson? There are less than 50 people in the entire commercial district who can teach him a lesson. None of them are people we can invite. What are you going to do to teach him a lesson? So powerful? The brown-haired youth was surprised. The blonde youth snorted. The monsters that were brought back from outside the giant wall were killed by these monsters. They are all monsters. What do you know? You are a frog at the bottom of the well. The brown-haired youth's face changed. He scratched his head and forced a smile. You are teaching me a lesson. Another brown-haired youth with a gentler appearance said, Young master, after all, he is the winner of the epic medal. In the near future, sooner or later, he will step into the senior oracle, and may even become a master. Let's not provoke such a person. The blonde youth indifferently said, I have already provoked him. Do you think I would be stupid enough to come and provoke him? Why would I set up such a terrifying enemy? The two youth looked at each other in confusion. The blonde youth didn't explain anything to them. It was normal for civilians to not understand the struggle between nobles. Even if they saw the newspaper, they didn't understand the source and purpose of the newspaper. They didn't understand the hostility and attacks behind it. Moreover, he disdained to talk about these things to civilians. Dean followed the girl out of the temple. Hey, isn't that Dean? Is that the genius Dean? The one who won the epic medal? At the moment it was 8 or 9 o'clock. There were a lot of architects who came out to exercise outside the temple. They were surprised to see Dean walking side by side with the girl. Only a few of them had strong self-esteem and didn't want to go over to watch. The girl was surprised to see the reaction of these people. She didn't expect that Dean's influence would be so strong. Dean was a bit distressed. He forced a smile and greeted these people. Chapter 308. Following the shady path in the castle, they came to a tower. The girl opened the door and said, Please, my artifact room is on the second floor. Dean nodded. Both of them entered the tower and went to the girl's room on the second floor. The size of the room was the same as Dean's room, but the furnishings were different. There were metal materials, metal shelves, and several small metal furnaces. There were also various metal container models. There was a bookcase near the window. There were all kinds of metal faction books. There were Metal Faction Encyclopedia, Basic Mystery of Metal Element, Metal Conflict, and so on. Dean looked at the girl. Do you have a carving knife? I'll carve the mold first. The girl was surprised. Aren't you going to make a new cage? The mold should be very big. I have a saw. Carving knife is enough, Dean said. Your door is too small. I can only forge the steel columns and transport them back to my castle for the final welding. The girl was startled. That's true. There was a trace of disappointment in his eyes. He thought that he would be able to witness the process of Dean's new invention. He didn't expect that he would only be able to see half of it. However, everyone's invention was top secret. There was no way to defend it if it was plagiarized before it was registered in the temple. Dean noticed the disappointment on her face but didn't care. He didn't need to show her the splitter's cage, since they weren't related. The girl found the carving knife and handed it to Dean. Dean took the wooden bar from the shelf, held the knife in his right hand, and quickly cut it. The blade was not too sharp, but with his great strength, he easily chiseled a straight circular mark on the wooden bar. Why didn't you draw the lines first? The girl was surprised as she saw Dean start. She saw that Dean's carving knife was straight without the slightest crookedness. There was a trace of surprise in her eyes. She thought of Dean's identity as a wood architect. She couldn't help but sigh. There were rumors that the boy relied on luck, but his proficiency in chiseling models was difficult to achieve without countless practice. Dean chiseled out some models of different length. He had already conceived the shape of the splitter's cage in his mind. The girl quietly watched from the side. She observed the youth's fingers from the side. She saw his slender fingers chiseling through the model as if he was cutting tofu. There wasn't the slightest bit of strain on his fingers. He was calm and graceful as if he was painting. She looked at him for a moment and suddenly said, Kedden had said that you are a hunter. Is that true? Are you also a civilian? Dean didn't raise his head. Yes. His black hair proved his identity. Although there were nobles who had hair colors other than gold, but there were very few of them. The girl couldn't help but look up at his cheek. There was a trace of fear in her eyes. She whispered, Hunters often deal with monsters. They are very bad people. Moreover, they are grumpy and arrogant. You seem to be very different from other hunters. Dudian indifferently said, The hunters I have seen are very modest, wise, and cautious. The girl carefully asked, Are you still a hunter? Dean's hand paused for a moment. He was silent for 0.2 seconds. I haven't done it for a long time. Really? The girl's eyes lit up and she said in surprise, That's great. Dean was silent as he quickly carved the model. While his left hand was practicing carving, his right hand's control had also increased a lot. Even if he was copying fine works of art, he could carve 70%, not to mention a rough model like the cage. All the models were finished after a moment. Dean looked for a chair to sit down and rest. He was thinking about other things as he waited for the materials to arrive. Knock. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. The girl who wanted to talk to Dean was surprised. She opened the door and indifferently said, What are you doing here? Ellen, I came to see you. A young man's voice came from outside. Can I come in to talk? No. The girl flatly refused. Her attitude was not polite. It seemed that both of them had some unpleasant things. The young man said, Ellen, I am also a guest. Why are you treating me like this? You are not my guest. Ellen indifferently said, I know what you are going to do. Don't have any ideas about me. The young man was angry as he saw her speak so bluntly. I heard that you have brought back a man. Is it true? Ellen coldly said, What does it have to do with you? You are one of my people. Of course it has something to do with me. The youth's voice was filled with anger. He pushed open the door and saw Dean sitting next to the bookshelf in the room. Dean was sitting next to the bookshelf and casually taking out various books. His eyes turned red. He pushed away Ellen's arm and stepped forward. Hey boy, who are you? Get out here. Tungsten gold element. Dean frowned as he heard the voice behind him. He turned around and looked at the person. It was a young man with light blonde hair. His appearance was above average. He was not handsome but not ugly. Judging from the material of his clothes and hair color, he should be a noble. But his hair color was diluted. He was either an aristocrat from the commercial district where the climate was relatively hot, so the aristocrats generally had light blonde hair, or he was a declining aristocrat. His father or ancestors had intermarried with civilians. With just a glance, Dean was able to see through the identity of the other party. This was not eyesight but experience. Although I don't know what your relationship is, but you better not yell at me. Dean indifferently said. The anger on the young man's face didn't diminish as he saw Dean's appearance. Apparently he didn't recognize Dean's identity. He rushed to the door and roared, I'm going to kill you. Don't. Ellen hurriedly reached out to block the door. Chapter 309. The young man and Ellen turned their heads at the same time. The one who spoke was a fair-skinned young man, elegant and handsome. He wore a pure white robe, but what was different from an ordinary robe was that there were 2 black dragons embroidered on his shoulders. The youth who was about to get angry saw the 2 black dragons. His face slightly changed. Isn't he wood element? How can he be here? You are looking for the wrong place. No. Ellen quickly replied. Mr. Dean is here. What do you want from him? The youth was startled as he heard Ellen's words. Suddenly, he remembered the medal on the chest of the youth who was sitting on the chair. Wood element intermediate level. Wasn't the legendary genius Dean also at the intermediate level of wood element? He took a deep breath as his face turned ugly. Did you say that person is Dean? Ellen looked at him and sighed. Yes, you are always like this. You can't change your impulsive character. The youth clenched his teeth. I won't give up on you even if he is Dean. Although I'm not as good as him, but I'm a noble and he is just a civilian. I know more than him in other aspects. Ellen was startled. I'm sorry. The youth apologetically interrupted the two. Can you take me to see Mr. Dean? My teacher asked me to pass a message to him. There was a trace of shock in Ellen's eyes. Your teacher? Master Black Dragon is looking for him? The youth was stunned. He felt that he had been slapped in the face. No matter how many things he knew, how could he be compared with a master? Even though he was a noble, he had never had the chance to interact with a great master, just like the Cloud Bird and the Earth Dragon. Although the latter was a commoner, his status was higher than many nobles, and now there was even a great master looking for him. Yes. The youth smiled and nodded. Ellen said, Please come in, he is inside. She moved aside to let the youth in. Dean, who was sitting on the chair and reading the book, heard the words outside the door. There was a trace of surprise in his eyes. He knew about the names and positions of some masters when he first entered the temple. For example, Ivissa was a master of lightning. Ivissa was nicknamed Hungry Thunder because he used lightning research as food. He would starve if he didn't eat for a day. Master Black Dragon, whose real name was Manta, was an earth element master. He was good at coal research. Therefore he got the title Black Dragon. Soon, the fair young man entered the God Relic Room under Ellen's lead, and the young man who was kicked out earlier followed behind. Hello, Mr. Dean. The youth's eyes lit up as he saw Dean sitting on the chair. My name is Dirya. My teacher Manta is looking for you to go to the Parliament of Gods. Parliament of Gods? Dudian was startled as his eyes lit up. Ellen and the youth were startled. Dirya smiled. The Parliament of Gods is mainly about you. My teacher told you not to be nervous. It's not a big deal. The meeting will be held at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Please be sure to go. Dean's face calmed down. I'll go. The youth smiled. Then I'll go back first. He bid farewell to Dudian, Ellen and the youth and went out of the door. Ellen and the youth recovered. Ellen was shocked as she looked at Dean. The meetings of the Temple of Gods were held to discuss important matters related to the temple. Historically, only master-level characters were able to enter the Temple of Gods. Moreover, not all masters were able to participate in the meetings of the Temple of Gods. This showed the importance of the Temple of Gods. Dean was probably the first person with the lowest rank to enter the Temple of Gods. The youth's face was complex as he whispered to Dean, Mr. Dean, I'm sorry. I offended you. After saying that, he lowered his head in humiliation. He was unwilling to apologize, and even more unwilling to apologize to another person in front of the person he loved. However, he realized that the youth sitting in front of him, who was only a few years younger than him, had the power to easily destroy his family. He did not dare to offend him. Ellen was shocked as she heard the youth's words. She had been in contact with the youth for a long time. She didn't expect such an arrogant person to apologize. Moreover, he was a noble. She had never seen a noble bow to a commoner. Dean indifferently said, It's nothing. I've already taken back the things that offended me. Don't bother me again. Go. The youth's face changed. He squeezed out a smile as he turned to leave. Dean looked at Ellen. The materials should be delivered soon. Go and have a look. Ellen nodded and instinctively walked out. She suddenly realized that she wasn't Dean's servant. She quickly walked out of the door. The Parliament of Gods wants to discuss about me? They probably want me to stop being a hunter. I didn't expect that the public opinion outside could even affect the temple. But to convene a meeting for such a trivial matter, they really think highly of me. Dean smiled as he put away the book. He got up and went to the furnace. He turned on the furnace and heated it up. The smell of tungsten steel had drifted over from outside. The tungsten steel cage should be ready before sunset. He could take advantage of the night to go out and look for the splitter. Dean wouldn't dare to go out at night if he was outside the giant wall. But he didn't care so much in the radiation zone. Although there were cases of senior hunters who were bitten to death by mutant monsters on their way to the outside of the giant wall. But after all, it was a big event that happened once in a few decades. The probability of encountering such an event was very low. Ellen and several civilian laborers came to the god's tools room. The latter held some tungsten steel materials and sent them to the room. "Put it here." Dean pointed to a place. Several laborers carefully put down the tungsten steel materials. Ellen was surprised when she saw that Dean was heating the furnace. "You are really impatient. Fortunately, they have delivered it." She came to another furnace. "I'll help you." "All right." Dean didn't refuse. The tungsten steel cage wasn't an innovative invention. Even a primary metal architect could make it. As time passed, a large number of tungsten steel materials were poured into the mold. They were cast into a wrist-thick steel column. The workers carried them to the carriage and transported them to Dean's castle. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Dean had smelted 3,000 kilograms of materials and refined them into hundreds of tungsten steel pillars. In addition, there were 8 wrist-thick curved hooks. All these things were entrusted to the public servants of the temple to transport to his castle. Chapter 310. The remaining 7,000 kilograms of tungsten steel had been sent to the castle by the time Dean returned to the castle. Dean told Nicholas to arrange people to put the tungsten steel materials in the waste field behind the castle. As for the 3,000 kilograms of tungsten steel cylinder and the tungsten steel hook, they were all piled up on the training ground next to the waste field. Dean asked Sergei and Jean to move the smelting furnace from the basement to the training ground. It was a small smelting furnace. It was about 3 meters high. He bought it from the market for more than 10 gold coins. Although 10 gold coins wasn't worth mentioning for him, but it was equivalent to 7 or 8 years of savings for civilians. Dean taught Sergei how to heat the furnace. He asked Nicholas to buy a batch of coal as fuel. In the era of electricity, steel welding was done by iron and fire. "Master, why do you want to make such a big cage?" Jean asked curiously as he saw the length of the tungsten steel. Dean poured molten iron into the welded parts of the tungsten steel. "I'm going to hunt monsters outside the giant wall. I'm going to use it as a trap." Sergei laughed. "You are willing to spend a lot of money. The cost of these things isn't small." Dean didn't reply as he focused on welding. The tungsten steel cage was finally formed after an hour. It was a square and 6 meters long. Considering the terrifying growth rate of Splitter, Dean deliberately made it twice as tall as Splitter. It was enough for a short period of time. Dean engraved the model of the chain. He melted the steel in the furnace. After a moment, 8 thick tungsten steel chains came out of the furnace. White smoke billowed out of the cold water. After cooling down, he connected one end of the chain to the tungsten steel hook and the other end to the cage. In the blink of an eye, all 8 directions of the cage were connected to the tungsten steel hook and the tungsten steel chain. Sergei and others were amazed as they saw the shape of the cage. At the same time, they were curious about the monster that Dean was going to hunt. Dean called the carriages. The carriages were prohibited from entering the main streets of the commercial district. They could only travel in the suburbs of the commercial district. There were different sizes of carriages. The largest one was an adult mammoth carriage. It was 7 to 8 meters high. Sound horn mammoth was a domesticated animal. It was used by humans like horses. Its fierce nature had been tamed and erased from generation to generation. It rarely attacked people. Nevertheless, the sound horn mammoth carriage was still prohibited from entering the main district. The first reason was that it would get out of control and trample on pedestrians. The second reason was that it was easy to damage the street surface. Dean asked Gwyneth and Sergei to move the cage to the carriage. The passage was too narrow for the cage to pass through, so it could only be placed here. Dean pierced the tungsten steel hook of the chain into the ground. The ground was cement and had long been soaked in moisture. Instead of relying on the strength of the cement, he returned to the basement and cut off some trees in the woods near the entrance of the building. He cut off the branches, sharpened the bottom, and made a few wooden frames. Then he fixed the four parts of the wooden frame with wood and used the hook to scoop out the soil. He dug a deep pit and buried the wooden frame in it. Splitter stayed next to him. From time to time it would swing its scythe arm on the tungsten steel cage to hone its weapon. A moment later, Dean dug a 7 or 8 meters deep pit in the ground. He hooked the crooked hook to the wooden frame and buried it from the four corners. Each corner had 2 chains. After that, he buried the soil. He held the thick tree trunk and pedaled it flat. Then he found some stones and pressed them on the soil. Dean was tired and sweaty after finishing these fixed jobs. Most of the night had passed and it was around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. He looked at Splitter, who was lying on the ground and sleeping soundly. He let out a sigh of relief and opened the tungsten steel cage. He wiped a bit of blood from the gauze on his shoulder and sprinkled it into the cage. Then, he jumped out of the basement and went back upstairs. Soon, he found a snake hole in the corner of the wall that had been soaked in the rain. He stabbed the hole with a dagger and pulled out 2 thick mutant earth snakes from inside. Splitter's eyes were wide open. Dean quickly cut them off and carried them back to the basement. Perhaps it was because of the smell of blood, but Splitter woke up. It gently moved and climbed up. It stared at Dean. Dean threw one mutant snake in front of Splitter and the other into the tungsten steel cage. Splitter didn't take any precautions. It went back into the cage after it finished eating the mutant snake in front of it. It picked up the other mutant snake and ate it. Clang! The tungsten steel cylinder fell from the top of the cage. Dean, who was waiting next to the cage, made a move. He put the hook on the bottom of the tungsten steel cylinder and locked it tightly. Splitter looked back as it heard the sound. It saw that the cage was sealed. It roared in a low voice and waved its scythe arm to cut the cage. Dean heard its anxious cry and slowly retreated. At the same time, he paid attention to the place where it cut the tungsten steel cylinder. There were only shallow scratches. His heart was relieved and his face showed a smile. He didn't expect everything to go so smoothly. He thought it would take a lot of effort, but now it was done in one night. Squeak! Splitter screamed impatiently. It attacked the tungsten steel cage with all its might, but it didn't have any effect. They would be the first to know if there was any major event that happened. Dean's arrival immediately attracted everyone's attention. The previous brown-haired youth spontaneously escorted Dean and let the people in front of him make way for him. Dean passed through the crowd and stood in front of the temple. The god's servant at the door recognized Dean, but he still asked him to show his identity medal. After the verification, he respectfully invited him in. This was the first time that Dean had come to the temple. The temple was extremely magnificent and solemn. It gave him a sacred feeling that couldn't be profaned. He knew that this was one of the few places that could decide the fate of all the people in the outer wall. Dean stepped into the temple and came to the second floor of the conference room under the guidance of the maid. The conference room was rectangular and more than 10 meters long. The layout and color of the items in the room incomparably rendered the solemn atmosphere. There were 4 people sitting in the conference room. All of them were over 50 years old. There were some white hairs in their hair. One of them looked to be nearly 70 years old. He had white hair and wrinkled skin. His expression was incomparably indifferent. Several people who were talking to each other looked at Dean as he entered the council room. Dean greets the seniors. Dean took the initiative to greet them in a modest manner. A short and fat old man with a mustache stood up and said, "I didn't expect the genius in the rumors to be more handsome than I imagined." Good. Another old man with a wide face laughed. "Dean, there is a small meeting today. Everyone hasn't arrived yet. You should wait for a while. Dean saw that there was no malice in the old man's smile. He nodded and stood at the side. The chunky old man didn't ask him to take a seat when he saw him standing. It seemed that he didn't do anything wrong. In their eyes, his identity wasn't enough to take a seat. If he took a seat, it would be a kind of disrespect. In some places, etiquette and rules were very important. They wouldn't forgive you just because you didn't understand it for the first time. After a moment, 3 more people arrived. 2 men and 1 woman. There were a total of 7 people in the conference room. Everyone is here. The last person to arrive was an elegant old man. He glanced at everyone and glanced at Dean, who was standing next to him. He didn't say anything but said with a smile, "This small meeting mainly talks about 2 things. The first is about the youngest genius in the history of the temple to win the Epoch Medal, Mr. Dean." Dean's expression didn't change as he quietly listened. "Mr. Dean, please come to me," the elegant old man said to Dean in a friendly manner. Dudian nodded and stood next to him. "Nice to meet you. My name is Cedron." The elegant old man smiled. "Today's discussion is related to you." Chapter 312. Sophistry. The 70-year-old man snorted. "Do you think that you can despise everything just because you got the Epoch Medal? When the sun rises, the darkness has already retreated. Why fight? How many people can you create a work of invention to replace the God of light to spread the gospel of the Lord? How many people can you benefit by hunting monsters? Can't you tell which is more important?" Dudian calmly said, "I said that I can quit as a hunter and concentrate on research. But I hope that you won't despise the hunter profession. If there are no hunters hunting monsters outside the giant wall, then what can you research? What do you know about the outside of the giant wall?" Presumptuous. The 70-year-old man stood up and glared at Dudian. "What are you talking about? Don't you have any etiquette? No wonder you are a peasant. You can't change your bad habits even after entering the temple." Dudian's face was cold. "If you want me to respect your age, then I hope that you will show me the cultivation that belongs to your age. You." The 70-year-old man was so angry that his eyes were wide open. "Well, Mr. Dean, don't be rude. Arson, don't bother with the younger generation. Mr. Dean comes from a civilian family and used to be a hunter. It's inevitable that he will have a bad temper. Please forgive him." The old man tried to persuade Dudian. The 70-year-old man, Arson, looked at him and restrained his anger. He coldly looked at Dudian. "Based on your words today, I can conclude that it will be difficult for you to touch the toe of the Lord's boots in the future." In the Temple of Elements, Lord referred to the God of light and toe referred to the Master. The origin of the word Lord came from the early days of the temple. There was a master who had been awarded a prize. He said that he had only touched the toe of the Lord's boots. He had only seen the tip of the iceberg. Later on, this sentence became a popular saying of many masters. "A lifetime is long. Don't talk too much," Dudian indifferently said. The old man in his 70s snorted coldly and sat back in his chair, not saying a word. He had seen too many geniuses and knew how proud they were. Dean was undoubtedly the most dazzling one among them. He was the youngest person in history to win the Epoch Medal. Therefore, he sighed, "Both of you, forget it. Mr. Dean has agreed to quit the hunter profession and will no longer go outside the giant wall. It shows that he knows the big picture. Arson, you don't have to follow the younger generation." Arson sneered and turned his head. Dean glanced at Arson's clothes and continued to listen to the words of the old man in a humble manner. "In addition to this, the second thing is about the war outside the borders. The continuous war has put a lot of pressure on the border. The military hopes that we can create some new military magic to completely defeat the barbarians. All of you here have made some achievements in the field of military magic. I hope that you can shift your focus to military magic in the near future and strive to create some new product. The broad-faced old man looked around at the crowd and said slowly. Dean's eyes slightly moved, but he didn't speak. The people on both sides of the long table looked at each other and fell into contemplation. The old man stroked his beard. Since the last time I made the snow shadow bow, I haven't touched the military divine art for a long time. But I have seen the improved version of the snow shadow bow, made by some intermediate architects. It should be able to upgrade the snow shadow bow. It should be able to reach the 4-star intermediate grade. The old man smiled. 4-star mid-grade is enough. I didn't expect such a terrible weapon like the snow shadow bow to have such a significant improvement. It seems that your attainments in this area have penetrated deep into the bone marrow. I'm flattered. The old man laughed and waved his hand. There was a bit of pride on his face. The old man smiled and looked at Dudian. Mr. Dean, your military crossbow is very good. If you can improve it, then it will be very helpful to the situation on the battlefield. I hope you can go back and study it. Dean nodded. I will. Well, the meeting is over, the old man announced. Everyone got up, passed by Dean, and went out one after another. Some of them nodded to him as they passed by. Some of them didn't even look at him. They had their own pride as masters. Even though Dean was an architect with extraordinary potential, he would become an outstanding master in the future. But it was possible that he would be stuck at the intermediate level. It wasn't impossible for him to get to know him in advance. The old man patted Dean's shoulder after everyone left. Let's go. Don't take Arson's temper to heart. He is right. I believe in your ability, but there is still etiquette. After all, he isn't the only master here. Dean looked at him. He knew that the old man was being kind. People of each rank had their own circle. They allowed infighting, but they didn't allow outsiders to despise them. This was the reason why he saw that the attitude of two masters wasn't as easygoing as before. It was obvious that they thought that Dean had despised all the masters. Well, Dean nodded but didn't say much. After leaving the Parliament, the Grand Masters walked out of the shrine one after another. They were escorted by their students on the first floor. They arrived at the carriage parked outside the shrine and left in it. The people waiting in front of the meeting made a spacious path for them. They looked at the masters in awe. There were more than 100 people, but there wasn't any noise. Dean and the old man came out side by side after all the masters had left. There was a commotion in the crowd when they saw Dean. There seemed to be a few exclamations. They didn't expect that the genius teenager who had been in the newspapers would be able to walk with the masters. It was such an honor that it made people jealous. Dean regretted that he didn't come by carriage as he looked at the crowd. I'll go first. Take good care of the new invention. The old man lifted the curtain and smiled at Dean. Dudian nodded. The commotion in the surroundings suddenly quieted down. Only after the carriage of the broad-faced old man rolled away did the crowd burst into an uproar. Everyone gasped and looked at the young man in the field with admiration and envy. They didn't expect that the progress of the latter's theurgy had already caught the attention of the Grandmaster. It should be known that the latter was only in the middle order. After the carriage was far away, Dean quickly left along with the crowd. The crowd reacted and immediately chased after him. Dean quickly ran. He didn't use his hunter's strength, but he was able to easily run past the weak architects. It must be known that his scavenger training wasn't in vain. Dean went to his own room after returning to the castle. He dismantled the lightning rod and wrapped it up. Then he carried it to the temple. This time he directly took the public carriage in the castle. Dean got off the carriage and dragged the suitcases down. He carried them with both hands and entered the temple. There were more than a dozen people in the temple. They were queuing up to submit their inventions. Dean came to a queue and waited for the 4 people in front to leave. Huh! The person in front saw someone behind him and looked back. Suddenly, he screamed in surprise and looked at Dean in confusion. He was startled and surprised. You are Dean? Genius Dean? Hello. Dean politely replied. The youth was flattered. Hello. Are you here to submit your invention? Dean nodded. Please, you go first, the youth said. Dean quickly refused. No, you go first. It's all right, I have a lot of time. All right. Dean exchanged places with the youth. At this time, the three people in front heard the youth's voice and looked back. The girl in front of Dean had a few small freckles on her face. Her face was full of excitement and nervousness. I'll exchange places with you. You go first. Dean saw the primary architect medal on her chest. Her hair color meant that she had such achievements at such an age. He didn't be polite and changed his position. The two people in front of him immediately changed their positions with Dean. Please submit your work of divinity, the man behind the counter said to the young man in front of him, and turned around to get the form. When he turned back, he saw the young man behind him. The young man in front of him was a fair-skinned young man. He was a little startled. He suddenly felt a little familiar. You are. Dean handed over the suitcase. This is my invention. My name is Dean. He handed over another folder. This is the design and assembly drawings. Dean? The woman behind the counter heard the name and suddenly remembered. She was pleasantly surprised. It's you? Your new invention? Yes. The woman was a little excited, but she didn't know what to say. She took the suitcase and quickly handed out the form. She said happily, fill in the identity form and then brand your medal on it. Dean quickly filled out the form and took off the medal. He printed it in a red powder box and then covered the form. Soon a metal pattern appeared with his name engraved on it. The review period is 1 to 3 days. It will be postponed by 1 day if there is a prayer day, the woman said with a smile. Thank you. Dean thanked them and left the counter. He thanked the 4 people who gave up their positions to him. He quickly left the temple and returned to his castle. The woman behind the counter didn't care about the rest of the 4 people as Dean left the temple. She picked up the form filled by Dean as well as the materials on the ground and went back to the small room. She came to a table and said to a middle-aged woman who was busy, Sister Lily, this is Dean's new invention. It belongs to the genius Dean. Sister Lee looked up in surprise. Is it his? She took the form from the woman's hand. She was startled when she saw the metal stamp on it. I know. You can go now. The woman nodded and left the small room after she put down the things. After she left, Big Cicely quickly stacked the suitcases on the ground and called a guard next to her. You carry these and follow me. Yes. The guard replied. Half an hour later, Sister Lee and the guard appeared in another castle and handed the suitcase to the staff behind the counter of this castle. The staff behind the counter saw the red mark on the suitcases. They knew that it meant priority review. They immediately sent people to the priority channel. The second floor of the 9th castle. Tea room. A slender woman was sitting in front of the piano. She was playing melodious music. The music was like a gurgling spring that surrounded the hall. There was a tea table under the piano. Ivissa took the tea from the table and poured it into the empty teacup in front of him. It was an old hand that picked up the cup of tea. The face of the old man was the same as Arson who Dean had just met. Don't you think it's annoying? Arson drank the tea. There was still some anger in his tone. You think that you will be a master in the future after getting the epic medal? Geniuses are always like this. Ivissa laughed. Arson said in a bad mood. What genius? Which one of us wasn't a genius when we were young? Which one of us wasn't a genius to reach this step? Ivissa slyly smiled. Copenhagen wasn't one. He was 60 years old when he started as a primary architect, but he soared to the sky and entered the Hall of Master. That's an exception. Arson rolled his eyes. How many of us are late bloomers like him? Look at the primary architect. How many of them are 60 years old and are still conscientiously studying the invention? Those who are in their 40s, have long been tired of the path of magic, bewitched by the music and music provided by the nobles in the outside world, indulging in worldly pleasures. These people are the vermin of the shrine, they should be expelled. It is indeed a long and boring road. There aren't many people like Copenhagen who have persisted for decades. Ivissa sighed. Arson snorted. Everything is a failure if there is no determination. Like this kid. So what if he is talented? Arrogant. Untouchables are untouchables. They won't learn how to eat in silence. Ivissa smiled but didn't reply. At this time, the butler of the castle ran over and respectfully said, Master E, there is a new lightning invention in the temple. They want you to review and identify it. Chapter 3:13. Lightning Faction? Ivissa was startled. Arson saw his expression and couldn't help but smile. Congratulations. Although you don't have many lightning oracles, but every time a lightning item is born, it is always at least 2 stars. The destructive power of lightning magic is too great. If this is a military item, it will definitely play a great role in the war. You are flattering me. Ivissa laughed. I'll go and have a look. I heard that Harley's work is almost complete. Maybe it is his thing. Well, I'll go back too. Arson got up. Both of them went out of the castle together. Ivissa also went to his own carriage after Arson left. They went to the Temple of Review. Dean ordered Sergei and Gwyneth to continue smelting the tungsten steel after he returned to the castle. This time they didn't cast a cage but 10 meters long spears. The tip of the spear was attached with shark fin barbs. Each spear had a hole in the back and was tied with a thick tungsten steel chain. Each chain was more than 150 meters long. Each spear weighed more than 1,000 kilograms including the chain. When the first shark spear appeared, Sergei, Gwyneth, Jean, Nicholas and the others were shocked to see it. The tungsten steel spear was heavy and sharp. It was just quietly placed in the open space next to the furnace, but it made people feel a chill down their spines. It seemed that even the air around them was a lot colder. Are you going to use this to hunt? Sergei was shocked as he looked at the teenager who was standing next to the furnace. What kind of hunter's mind was that he could come up with such a terrible weapon? Dean continued to carve the model in his hand. He didn't reply as it was necessary to maintain a sense of mystery as the leader. The main purpose of the shark lance was to hunt the Great Splitter and other giant monsters in the future. It wasn't his original creation, but he had learned it from the super chip. In the Middle Ages, some fishermen would go to the sea to hunt great white sharks, whales and other giant sea beasts. However, the size of the shark lance wasn't as strong as this one. It wasn't made of tungsten steel and the ropes were linen rope. Sergei and the others were amazed for a moment but continued to work. Soon the remaining 7,000 kilograms of tungsten steel were used up. Dean contacted the Temple of Elements and bought another batch of tungsten steel. But this time he didn't look for Ellen, but another person. Although looking for Ellen would save him time, but he didn't understand Ellen's life circle. Moreover, he didn't have time to understand her life circle. If it was spread out, it would inevitably attract the attention of other consortiums. The production of the shark spear continued in the afternoon until the evening. After Dean finished carving the mold, the rest of the smelting work was handed over to Sergei, Gwyneth, Nicholas and others. Although they didn't have much experience, but the skills involved in this matter weren't that high. They could basically master it after teaching them once. Dean went back to his room and took out a few rolls of snow paper. This was the paper with the highest level of craftsmanship. It was used by nobles. He spread out the snow paper and poured the ink into the quill pen. He pondered for a moment and then began to carve the design drawings. If other architects saw this, they would be very surprised because Dean's pen was very stable. Whether it was straight lines or curved lines, he drew them more accurately than a ruler. Even Gwyneth and Sergei would be surprised if they saw this. Such fine control of power was something that even veteran hunters couldn't achieve. Dean was used to it. The flexibility of his right hand was inseparable from the exercise of his left hand. It was also inseparable from his daily self-training in prison. Most people who entered a prison like the Thornflower prison would abandon themselves to despair. But Dean had been thinking about various hunting techniques and exercising his body's flexibility in addition to digging holes. He firmly believed that one day he would be able to get out of there. It turned out that persistence was an advantage at some point. Whoosh! The outline of a fine structure gradually appeared as the quill pen drew on the snow paper. The shape was strange. Only Dean knew that the things written on the paper would completely change the world and the entire temple, and this was the first step on the road of conquest. A few hours later, the few sheets of paper were completely filled with drawings. There were no traces of any alterations, as if they had been made by nature. The meticulous structure, the specific functions of each part, and the purpose of the entire work were all written on the design paper. The picture was harmonious and pleasing to the eye. Dean put away the pen and spread out a few pieces of paper. He waited for them to dry before rolling them up and putting them into a silk bag. Then he put them into his dark box. Dean came to the windowsill and looked at the training ground behind the castle. Sergei and the others were smelting tungsten steel. He saw that they weren't lazy, so he took out the wood carving and continued to carve with his left hand. Although he had been practicing for a long time, but he felt that there wasn't a significant effect on his left hand. But the improvement of his right hand was very obvious. However, Dean didn't lack patience. The next day, Dean found another person and bought a batch of tungsten steel materials. This time he didn't refine shark spear but cannon crossbow. Such a heavy shark spear couldn't be thrown to kill the enemy. Only a cannon crossbow could accurately shoot into the target's body. The structure of the cannon crossbow was similar to that of a cannon. The key point was the tension rope. It was a kind of synthetic rope made of monster materials. It was not a pure fiber. It was generally used by the army in the border fortress. However, the shape of the arrow was more traditional. It could only be used to hunt barbarians. Often a crossbow arrow could penetrate the chest of 7 or 8 people and nailed them to the ground. The strength of the arrow was so great that it could be seen that it was terrifying. However, the crossbow shaft was made of wood while Dean's was made of tungsten steel. There was a huge difference in the weight. Therefore, the requirements for the rope were extremely high. Dean engraved the mold after the materials were transported back. He used eagle tendon rope to make a crossbow. Sergei, Gwyneth, Nicholas and others held their breath as they went to the hillside behind the castle to test it out. Whoosh! The tungsten steel shark spear jumped out when the rope popped out. The chain behind the spear rattled as it flew for hundreds of meters. Its momentum was greatly reduced as it slid down and pierced the ground. It penetrated 4 or 5 meters deep. He put away the design drawings and said, "Today is cloudy. It should rain tomorrow. We will wait for the thunder to test the effect. If it is successful." His eyelids slightly twitched as he thought of this. If the design drawings were true, then the value of this thing would be too great. It should be noted that there were many lightning bolts during the rainy season and the black snow season. Many residents, including nobles, would be struck by lightning bolts. It was a small matter if the houses were damaged, but it would be terrible if people were crushed to death. Moreover, as far as he knew, the number of people who died from natural lightning bolts was at least a third of those who died from radiation. This was an extremely terrifying number. Yes. The attendant respectfully replied as he heard Ivisa's words. Ivisa put down the design drawings and turned to leave the empty room. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. It greatly increased the probability of lightning falling. At the same time, because of the giant wall, it had some influence on the climate. The height of the clouds was generally lower than outside the giant wall. This was one of the reasons why lightning was one of the main disasters inside the giant wall. The lightning rod was enscathed in the continuous lightning strike. Ivissa and the others watched the scene of lightning flashing more than 10 meters away. They were shocked at the beginning but gradually intoxicated by the magnificence of the lightning. It was like watching a great art exhibition. The rain lasted for more than 3 hours. Ivissa, the short old man and others stood in the rain for more than 3 hours. Even if they were the highest master of opera or music, they wouldn't be able to stand in the rain for more than 3 hours. In the castle, the oil lamp on the wall burned quietly, and the fragrant light warmed the entire hall. All the windows were closed, and the rain gently fell outside the window. 2 maids stood quietly together, and it was obvious that their legs were a little sore from standing, but they still quietly persevered. Sergei, Gwyneth, Jean and others were sitting on the sofa. They were eating the newly bought fruit. Dudyan stood in front of a window. He gently opened the window and looked at the crystal-clear rain. Although it looked clean and bright, but he could see that the water was light black. Naturally, it wasn't because the ground was too dirty. "Master, are you cold?" Nicholas came forward and asked in a respectful tone. Dudyan didn't look back. "Come here." Nicholas was startled but still took a small step forward. Dudyan asked, "What do you see?" Nicotine was taken aback. He looked out of the window and asked doubtfully, "Rain? Where does the rain come from?" "Of course it comes from the dark clouds." "Where does the dark clouds come from?" This slave doesn't know." Dudyan was silent. He seemed to be lost as he whispered, "Have you ever thought about the meaning of human life?" Nicholas was slightly startled. His eyes flashed as he said, "This servant does not understand such a philosophical question. I only know that my purpose here is to serve you well. Although I have offended you many times in the past, and my heart is rebellious, but now that I am old, I do not want to struggle anymore. I hope Master can trust me once more." Dudyan retracted his eyes and looked at Nicholas. Nicholas's eyes were calm and full of sincerity. Dudyan raised his hand and patted Nicholas's shoulder. "Prepare a carriage for me. I'm going to the Ryan family." "Yes," Nicholas replied in a respectful tone. Sergei and others heard that Dudyan was going to go out. Jean said, "I'll go with you." "No need," Sergei casually said as he peeled a fruit. "You have been going to the Ryan family every night for the past few days. Have you taken a fancy to a lady of the Ryan family?" Splitter quickly ate the pork that was thrown into the cage. It was very happy and excited. After all, it was the only meal it had every day. Dudyan put on a raincoat and took out a small sachet that was hanging around his neck. It was different from the other sachets. It didn't contain spices but the blood and dried shell of Splitter. Dudyan returned to the giant wall after leaving the basement. After several back and forth, Dudyan was familiar with the route. Half an hour later, he bypassed a desolate mountain range. Suddenly, he saw a shadow swaying at the foot of the mountain in front of him, like a ghost. Dean was surprised. He fixed his eyes on them and couldn't help but be startled. He saw that in the drizzle, the silhouettes were connected to each other. It looked like more than a dozen people. These people were in a team, holding strange long weapons in their hands, quietly moving in one direction. Dudyan's heart skipped a beat. Barbarians? He quietly pushed aside the grass and approached. He immediately saw the appearance of these people clearly. Some were tall, some were short, but their skin was dark and rough. They looked like people from remote tribes like India in the West in the old era. They had beast-tooth collars around their necks, and in their hands were weapons inlaid with beast bones and wooden sticks. At their waists were fine short knives. They seemed a bit out of place. Dudyan thought of the knives he had picked up last time outside the giant wall. His face slightly changed. He didn't think that the knives were really used by barbarians. He saw that the barbarians didn't have raincoat. They didn't care about the rain falling on their bodies. At the moment the barbarians went to a steep wall that was overgrown with weeds. The barbarians at the front pushed away the weeds and went in. The rest of the barbarians went in and put the weeds back to the original position. Dudian estimated that he wouldn't have noticed the barbarian's nest if he didn't see them enter. He gently sniffed. Although the rain diluted the smell, but he could still smell a mixture of human and beast. He remembered the smell and quietly left the place. Chapter 3:16. July 30th. It was cloudy. After yesterday's heavy rain, the air was rather humid, and the breeze was biting cold. The change in the climate indicated that the terrible black snow season was coming. The sacrificial platform in the light church and in the square had been built, and a large number of people had gathered under the platform, clustered around the statue on the platform. Although the ceremony had not officially begun, the people had already begun to pray devoutly. On the same day, at the break of dawn, in the castle of the House of Chai, the main family of the Scott consortium, a figure secretly entered the castle from the side. Two figures were waiting at the entrance of the passage. The figure came to a secret room in the castle and took out a secret report. The cover of the report was engraved with 9 stars. Nobles were very familiar with this symbol. It symbolized the main institution of the Holy Church, the Temple of Elements. An old man wearing a black mask in the secret room seemed to know the identity of the person who came. He quickly took the secret report and opened it. There was a short poem by a famous poet on it. He glanced at it and his pupils suddenly shrank. His fingers holding the secret report slightly trembled. After a moment, he restrained his shock and said in a hoarse voice, "Go." The shadow who handed over the secret report didn't say anything. He just nodded and quickly turned around and left. After watching him leave, the black-masked old man put away the secret report, turned around, and entered another secret passage in the underground secret room. After passing through several corridors, he came to a basement where miscellaneous items were stored. He turned around and twisted the mechanism on the wall, closing the door of the secret basement under the miscellaneous items basement. He took off his mask and put it in his robe, walked out of the miscellaneous items basement, and came to the hall of the castle. He looked at the 60-years-old clock on the wall. It was still early. He took a light breath and slowly exhaled. His mood calmed down. He looked for the maid. "It's getting late. Get ready to work." "Yes, butler." The maid looked at the old man and replied. The sun rose and the warm sunlight shone on the window of the castle. The young ladies and young masters of the Chai family all woke up one after another. Some of the younger third-generation descendants were curled up in their blankets, unwilling to get out of bed. At 7 o'clock, all the ladies and young masters came to the hall. Even the third generation who liked to sleep in were no exception. Because at this time, their grandfather, the head of the Chai family, Chai Rostov, would get up on time and come to the hall to enjoy breakfast with everyone. This was the way of life of the Chai family, and no one dared to disobey. However, the young masters and ladies of the Chai family were waiting in the hall for a long time. They couldn't help but feel anxious and surprised. In their memory, Chai Rostov never got up late. His life was as regular as a marionette. This could only mean that there was something more important waiting for Chai Rostov's bed, and it was usually the business of the consortium. For a time, everyone in the hall had different thoughts and guesses. Chastov's room. Looking at the secret report handed over by the old butler, Chai Rostov rubbed his eyes and took the report. He stretched out his other hand. The butler took the glasses and respectfully handed it over to Chai Rostov. After putting on his glasses, Chai slowly opened the secret report and read through it. Then, he slowly closed the report and handed it to the old butler. His facial expression didn't change much. His thick eyebrows were full of majesty and mysteriousness. It seemed like he had countless thoughts in his mind and could see through countless people's hearts. "Old master." The old butler looked at him inquiringly. Chai Rostov was silent for a moment. "This time, we must get this thing at all costs." "Yes." The butler nodded respectfully. Chai Rostov put on his shoes and got out of bed. He changed his clothes and went to the hall with the old butler. In the hall, All the ladies and young masters of the Chai family stood up in awe. After Chai Rostov sat down, everyone sat down according to their status. The old butler passed the morning newspaper to Chai Rostov. He knew that Chai Rostov liked to read the newspaper during breakfast as it would save time and increase efficiency. The first newspaper that Chai Rostov picked up was not the newspaper of his consortium, nor the newspaper of the nobles, but the newspaper of the military. For him, he already knew what would happen to his consortium and what would be reported in tomorrow's newspaper. At his level, there were only two things that could shake the foundation of the Scott consortium. The first was the military and the second was the Holy Church. Currently, the war at the border was unpredictable, and it was hard to predict the situation. He could only rely on the military newspaper to understand the situation. This war was not a life and death battle for him, it was a business opportunity for him to make money. His famous saying was, "Where there is a struggle, there is a business." This saying had influenced many rich businessmen. It was also the principle that he used to do business. Relying on the geographical advantage of the fortress and the military magic, they are still at a disadvantage? Chai Rostov thought. These barbarians who only rely on brute force actually learned to use strategy. Interesting. On the same morning, Huashan Consortium, Melon Consortium, Krulov Consortium and other 5 consortia received secret reports from their staff in the Temple of Elements. When they confirmed the above information, all the consortia were like silent beasts. In any case, he expected the lightning rod to reach the 4-star level. After all, the Temple of Elements didn't only look at the work itself but also the current situation, environment and other factors to judge. Dean saw the second news in the newspaper. It turned out to be about him. One person occupied the headlines and the second page. According to the Temple statistics, Mr. Dean's accumulated points have reached the level of senior architect. From today onwards, he will be promoted to a senior architect. Dean glanced at the newspaper and almost forgot about the point. Indeed, it was enough to promote to a senior architect after producing 2 4-star work. Most architects had to produce a large number of 2-star and 3-star works to accumulate enough points to be promoted to a senior architect. It was a hard requirement of the Temple. No matter how high the points were, one must have a 4-star work in order to be promoted to a senior architect. Similarly, an intermediate architect must have a 3-star work in order to be promoted to a senior architect. As for the masters of the Temple, the difficulty was much higher. They must produce 2 5-star works in order to be promoted to a master. Therefore, there was a huge gap between a master and an architect. Nicholas, who was standing behind Dean, was shocked as he saw Dean reading the newspaper. Although he knew very little about the Temple of Elements, but he still remembered the experience of a primary architect from the Temple. But now Dean was a senior architect. Moreover, it could be seen from the newspaper that his status was much higher than an ordinary senior architect. Church Hill, the 9th castle. Ivissa held the newspaper in his hand as his complexion turned ugly. Although he could find out who the creator of the invention was, but he was too lazy to use his connections. In any case, the invention wasn't his. But he didn't think that this magnificent lightning invention turned out to be the work of this person. How was it possible? How was it possible for a 16-year-old boy to produce a top-grade 4-star item? If Dean was from a tailor's family, then he was able to produce the military crossbow, which was his talent. But what about the invention of lightning? Genius? Genius? He suddenly remembered that a long time ago, this young man came to the shrine for the first time and came here to visit him. He wanted to be his assistant and participate in a project he had produced at that time, but he refused. He did not expect that today, the latter had achieved such achievements in lightning magic and entered the ranks of senior architects. If one only looked at his resume, it should be more magnificent than any other senior architect's resume. Ivissa slightly gritted his teeth as he threw the newspaper on the table. In another divine castle, Arsene was eating breakfast with a smile on his face. He was 70 years old this year. He knew that he didn't have many years left to live. So he often reminded himself to be happy every day. In fact, there were very few things that could arouse his disgust and unhappiness. He didn't care even if his inventions failed. After all, he had failed many times in his life. So he had learned to laugh at failures. He also taught his students the same way. However, when his eyes fell on the Divine Arts Daily, the smile on his face suddenly froze. There was no trace of a smile on his face as he read the entire newspaper. His mouth twitched for a moment as he picked up his coat and left the castle. Ryan family. Old Foulin looked at the newspaper in front of him. There was a smile in his eyes as he looked at Sander. You see, I know that he will never do things that he is not sure of. The Melon Consortium has to swallow back all the comments that have been released by the Melon Consortium. I reckon that tomorrow the Scott Consortium's newspaper will ridicule the Melon Consortium's news agency for accompanying singers. Haha. These defamatory words will add a touch of brilliance to his halo of glory. Even if it's just accompanying singers, he can produce 4-star top-grade items. Don't you think it's amazing? Sander laughed as he heard his father's joke. That's why the most powerful counterattack is your own strength. It's good that you understand. Old Foulin smiled. Sander sighed. It's hard to imagine that a 16-year-old civilian boy would appear in the line of sight of all the nobles every day. Moreover, he has occupied the first page of the temple's newspaper. Perhaps today should be called Dudian Day. Old Foulin's eyes lit up as he laughed. Yes, this is a good opportunity to build momentum. Immediately contact Huashan Consortium and other consortia. Dean is hot and they are willing to sell him a favor. Let them write about this in tomorrow's newspaper. Haha. From now on, today will be Dean Day. Chapter 317. Prayer Day. Civilians gathered in the square where the sacrificial platform was built. The priest of the Holy Church, accompanied by 3 priests of the Holy Church, went up to the platform and began to recite prayers. Tens of thousands of words of praise poems were selected from the Holy Church's Holy Bible. The civilians had long been familiar with it. After all, every household had a copy of the Holy Bible. Every year they would listen to the priest of the Holy Church's chanting. The ancient Chinese proverb was also applicable in this era. It was deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. The people listened carefully. They clasped their hands and fingers as they prayed devoutly. Inside the castle, Dean stood in front of the window-sill, looking at groups of civilians gathered in the nearby square from the distant streets of the castle. These people came from nearby towns. He knew that today his reputation had not reached the ears of ordinary civilians. Today should be the worst day of newspaper sales in the past 3 months, but among the top executives of major consortiums, his reputation should be spread. It would only take 1 day for the civilians and some nobles to know his name. In many cases, money couldn't buy fame. But fame could be converted into wealth, rights, convenience, and so on. Master, someone is looking for you. At this time, Nicholas came from behind and respectfully said. Dudian nodded. He had seen through the window that an aristocratic carriage was entering the castle. The flag on the carriage belonged to the Scott Consortium. It was obvious that the intelligence system of the Scott Consortium was far deeper and more dense than the other consortia. Dudian waved his hand to let Nicholas go out to greet him. Even a big consortium like the Scott Consortium couldn't go out to greet him personally. This wasn't arrogance but majesty and etiquette. A moment later, Nicholas brought a young lady dressed in bright jewels into the hall. She was tall and slender, with a voluptuous figure and an extremely attractive figure. Her movements were elegant and calm, and she had the etiquette and magnanimity of a noble. Dudian's eyes slightly moved as he saw her. Mr. Dean, I'm Rosie. We meet again. The young woman saw the teenager sitting in the hall. There was a trace of surprise on her face. She took the initiative to come forward. Dudian smiled and slowly got up. He waited for her to come closer. He shook her hand and said, "You are a guest. Please sit down." "You're too polite to treat me as a guest." Rosie smiled and sat on a chair next to him. She looked up at the castle and enviously said, "Your castle is decorated very well. It's simple and atmospheric. I like this style the most." Dean faintly smiled. "Since you like it so much, then move in. I have plenty of rooms." Rosie was just being polite. She didn't expect Dean to be so hospitable. She responded quickly, "Well, I'll definitely come if my husband allows it. I'm afraid that my temper will give you a headache. If I interfere with your thoughts, then I won't be able to atone for my sins." Dean smiled. "Miss Wei didn't come here just to see my castle, right?" Rosie giggled. "Both. But today I'm here to congratulate you for being promoted to senior architect. As far as I know, you are the youngest senior architect of the temple in 100 years. If Tracy hadn't become a senior architect at the age of 9 more than 150 years ago, then you would be the youngest senior architect in the history of the temple. Even if you don't do anything for the rest of your life, your name will be forever engraved in the history of the temple." Dean gently nodded. Dudian nodded. He had heard of Tracy's name. She wasn't a stranger to the people of the temple. Although 150 years had passed, but whenever they talked about the most talented person in the temple, it would be this woman. She could be described as a genuine child prodigy. At the age of 9, she had produced 2 4-star items and became a senior architect. Unfortunately, at the age of 10, she suffered from a rare disease. At that time, it was difficult to cure the disease due to the medical conditions at that time. She only had 3 months left to live when the disease was discovered. In the end, she wasn't rescued and died. Whenever this was mentioned, people would sigh with emotion. Some people even thought that if the woman didn't die, she would have become a master architect before the age of 20. "Mr. Dean, can you sell your new invention, lightning rod, to the Scott Consortium?" Rosie clenched her teeth as she looked at Dean. Dean looked at her and pretended to hesitate. Rosie's eyes lit up. "The Scott Consortium is willing to give you a 5-star price and half of the future sales of the new textile machine. What do you think? If you have any other requirements, then I promise that I will do my best to fulfill them for you. We are old friends, right?" Dean said. "I heard that your consortium and the Melon Consortium have been competing for the mineral industry. I presume that your consortium has a deep penetration into the Melon Consortium?" There was a trace of awakening in Rosie's eyes. "I almost forgot that the Melon Consortium has tried to frame you several times. Now that your reputation is high, they will be worried that you will retaliate against them. They will come up with other insidious ways to harm you. You can rest assured that with the support of the Scott Consortium, they won't be able to hurt you. But you have to guard against insidious ways. I will ask the informants in the consortium to help you pay attention to the actions of the Melon Consortium. I will inform you if there is any news." Dean nodded. "All right, we'll talk about the invention once we get the news." Rosie was startled. "Mr. Dean, what do you mean? Miss Rosie is so smart. Do you not understand?" Dean replied. Rosie couldn't help but ask, "Mr. Dean, don't you trust me? Wouldn't we have to wait if the Melon Consortium isn't plotting against you?" "I trust you. But since we are talking about business, then naturally we will follow the rules of business." Dean faintly smiled. "Melon Consortium will take action as soon as my news comes out. I think you should be able to find out about it. This is the first deposit. I will sell the lightning rod to you after you provide 3 valid information or after the rainy season comes next year. You can rest assured that I will keep it for your consortium. I won't talk to other consortiums for the time being." Dean smiled. Rosie was startled and her face became stiff. She forced a smile and said, "Mr. Dean, lightning rod has just been released. It will definitely spread to the 3 districts tomorrow. If you sell it to us now, we will be able to produce it before the rainy season comes. In the next few months, we will also promote the roll and production process of Lightning Rod to maintain its popularity. If we really wait until the rainy season comes to sell it, then I'm afraid, Dean said. It depends on the intelligence capabilities of your consortium. I believe in you. Rosie smiled. She sighed as she saw that Dean didn't mean to turn back. Well, I hope that Mr. Dean can keep his promise and refuse to buy from other consortiums. I will. Dudian smiled. Rosie saw his smile. She felt uneasy in her heart. But she knew that she couldn't get any guarantees from Dean. The choice was in the hands of the latter. If she angered the other, she could change to another house. After thinking for a while, she slowly relaxed and smiled. I believe in Mr. Dean. In that case, I wish us a happy cooperation. She stretched out her slender hand. Dean shook hands. It's a pleasure to cooperate with you. There was a trace of helpless smile on Rosie's face as they loosened their hands. If I had known that Mr. Dean would have offered me a 4-star price, I would have directly agreed to it. Because of this matter, I'm being scolded to death by my family. It's all your fault. She looked at Dean coquettishly. Dean's heart was calm. If you had agreed, then you would have been scolded to death by your family. Rosie couldn't help but smile, but then she sighed and said, In the end, it's my fault for not recognizing a true talent. Mr. Dew, please don't be offended. I didn't look down on you at that time, I just didn't expect your ability to be so amazing. Dean waved his hand. It's a trivial matter. Don't worry about it. Rosie rolled her eyes. It's good that Mr. Dean doesn't blame me. By the way, can you pre-order your next invention to our Scott Consortium? No matter what you make, our Scott Consortium is willing to pay the price of a top 4-star invention. Dudian smiled. He thought that Scott Consortium was cunning and wanted to negotiate 2 deals at once. Moreover, Scott Consortium didn't even see the shadow of the invention but dared to offer such a high price. Dudian knew that Dudian wouldn't deliberately produce an ordinary invention for this amount of money. After all, Dudian cared more about other people's respect for him than wealth. That is, face. 4 stars is too low. Dean shook his head and refused. Rosie's eyes lit up. Last time Dean didn't even think about it and refused. It showed that Dean had a new idea in his mind and was very confident. She deliberately took a deep breath. In that case, we will offer the same price as this time. What do you think? You are really willing to spend. Dean couldn't help but sigh. A 5-star invention was worth millions of gold coins. It was enough to support the food expenses of the slums for more than 30 years. If it was used for construction, then the slums could be built to the same level as the civilian area. However, the Scott Consortium was willing to pay such a large amount of money without even seeing the shadow of the invention. This was the wealth brought by the invention. This was the influence of the reputation of a genius. However, this amount of money could only be regarded as the upper level in the commercial district. The tilt of the wealth within the giant wall was seriously unbalanced. So any rich businessman in the commercial district could become a local tyrant in the slums. But in the slums, they could only sit back and eat. This was why the labor in the slums was so cheap. But not many rich businessmen were willing to live and develop in the slums. Even a fish in stagnant water would slowly suffocate. Not enough. Dean slowly shook his head. Too low. Rosie was startled. Not enough? Or too low? She couldn't help but look at Dean. Even with her self-cultivation and restraint, at this moment, she couldn't help but expose some of her inner thoughts on her face. 5-star is already the top, how much higher do you want? Dean naturally understood her expression. He shrugged and said, If you want to pre-order, pay me the money now. I can consider selling it to you at 5-star price. This is the only opportunity. Rosie almost choked and spat out a mouthful of blood. 5-star high grade? Why didn't you say it was higher? This is the only opportunity? She couldn't wait to knock on the young man's head. Could it be that he had become so arrogant that he didn't even know who he was after producing 3 high-quality divine arts in a row? If it were someone else who said this, she would probably have drawn her sword. You. Rosie swallowed her words and held back her temper. She took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. She forced a smile and said, "You raised the price too high. I'm scared. Please don't be offended." This price is a bit," Dean asked. "Does it mean that you refuse?" "I'm crazy if you don't refuse." Rosie couldn't help but choke in her heart. It's not a refusal. It's just that the amount of money is too much for our consortium. It seems that you can't buy it since your consortium is so poor. Dean shrugged. "I've given you the opportunity. Don't say that I didn't sell you a favor." Rosie's mouth and eyelids twitched. She couldn't control her murderous aura. She lowered her head and didn't dare to look at Dean's expression. She was afraid that she would lose control of her fist. She gritted her teeth. "Mr. Dean, I'll leave first. I'll inform you the first if there's news from Melon Consortium. Take care. See off the guest." Nicholas, who was standing next to Rosie, immediately stepped forward and escorted her out of the hall. It didn't take long for Rosie to leave. Huasheng Consortium's people came to the castle to visit Dean with a lot of gift. Dean asked Nicholas to accept the expensive herbs and watches. He politely declined Huasheng Consortium's offer on the grounds that he wasn't going to sell them for the time being. He didn't directly refuse them. Huasheng Consortium was extremely disappointed as they didn't come to an agreement. They immediately made the same plan as Rosie. They wanted to pre-order Dean's next invention. Dean wasn't biased as he gave the same price as Rosie. The person in charge of Huasheng Consortium asked twice to confirm that there wasn't a problem with his ears. He was stunned for a moment before he smiled and declined. He bid farewell to Dean and left the castle. Chapter 3:18. 5-star price. The diplomat of the Green Consortium almost bit his tongue as he heard Dean's words. He looked at Dean in amazement. "Mr. Dean, did I hear it wrong, or are you didn't hear it wrong? There is only one chance. Do you want to buy it or not?" Dean was too lazy to say more. His patience had been exhausted after receiving several consortiums. For him, it was better to learn more about the knowledge in the superchip or exercise the flexibility of his left hand than to use the time to negotiate business. The diplomat of the Green Consortium saw the impatience on Dean's face. He was dumbfounded. "Mr. Dean, your price is too high. I need to go back and report to the consortium. I can't make the decision on this matter. If you can give me a reply within 2 days. Dean was too lazy to say more. He looked at Nicholas. "Send the guest off." "Yes, master." Nicholas's attitude was respectful, but his heart was shocked. He was familiar with the names of the Green Consortium, Krulov Consortium, and other consortiums. It could be said that these consortiums controlled the entire commercial district and even the mainstream economy of the entire outer wall. They were famous supergiants in the aristocratic and wealthy circles. Countless people could enjoy the plucking of their leg hair. Even a fool could see that Dean's influence and value were terrifying. "Please." He turned to the diplomat and said politely. But there was some regret in his heart. If he had known earlier, he would not have played those tricks. He would have been a prominent figure in the future if he could get Dean's trust. Just like how he once stole the property of an aristocrat and became a rich businessman. But when he went to some prestigious aristocratic family, he had to be polite to the housekeeper and servant. He didn't dare to have the slightest contempt. The diplomat sighed and shook his head. He turned and left. Dean asked Nicholas to prepare the carriage after the diplomat left. He went to the Temple of Elements to receive his senior architect medal. At the same time, he exchanged some materials he needed in the temple. Scott Financial Group. Inside the conference hall, a dozen figures were sitting on both sides of the conference table. The one sitting at the head was an old man wearing a gorgeous black suit with gold embroidery. All the nobles living in the central area knew that this was the unique attire of the Chai family. This dignified and reserved old man was the head of the Chai family, Chai Rostov. He was also the biggest director of the Scott Consortium and had the final say. Are you sure? Chai stared at the woman who attacked him. It was Rosie. Rosie bitterly smiled and said, I've repeatedly confirmed it. There's no mistake. Moreover, he said that it's a friendship prize. After this opportunity, he won't give it again. He's crazy. The middle-aged man on the other side of the long table widened his eyes and said angrily, 5-star high grade, and it's a friendship price? If that wasn't the friendship price, then what was? He even said that there would be no more chances after this. That's insane. This is too exaggerated. Another old man shook his head and sighed. An elegant lady next to him said in a cold voice, If I remember correctly, he's only 16 years old, right? A 16-year-old boy has produced 3 outstanding works of magic in a row. I do admire his talent in magic. But he has to bear such a great honor at such a young age. His adoptive parents are still living in the civilian area, and there is no one to teach him. It is inevitable that he will be emotional. What a pity. I hope that when he suffers a setback, he will not be unable to recover. Now that he has been praised to such a high level, no matter what kind of genius he is, it's inevitable that he will be buried by the secular world. Another thin middle-aged man said. Chai listened to the voices of the crowd in silence. After a moment, he slowly said, You go and tell him that we can only offer the price of 5 stars medium grade. High grade is impossible. If he doesn't agree, then forget it. I've already given him the chance. Rosie bitterly smiled and said, Based on my understanding of him, he won't agree. Moreover, I have also tried, but his attitude is very resolute. He isn't deliberately proposing a high price to pull us down, but rather a fixed price. Chai Rostov's mouth slightly twitched. Then contact our informants as soon as possible. Infiltrate into Melon Consortium and steal the information about Mr. Dean. Strive to seize the lightning rod as soon as possible. The other consortiums will get the same information. No one will agree unless they are crazy. Rostov sighed. I know. I'll do it as soon as possible. Others looked at each other but didn't continue to say anything. Although Rosie's attitude towards Dean was now a senior architect of the Temple of Elements. His potential was extremely high, so they didn't dare to talk too much behind his back. After all, although they were from the same consortium, but they weren't a family. They weren't as friendly as they looked on the surface. Temple of Elements. Dudian ordered the coachman to go directly to the Temple of Elements. The carriage had the flag of the Temple of Elements. He could freely enter and exit most of the places of the Temple of Elements except for the castles of other masters. Dean was relieved that no one recognized him along the way. He took off a mask and covered his face after arriving at the castle. He went into the hall of the temple and found the exchange office. He selected the items he needed from the catalog. After 7 or 8 minutes of selection, he finally selected 3 items. Although the effect was slightly worse than he expected, but it would be effective if the quantity was enough. Nowadays, his every move was being watched by countless people. There may be spies of other consortia lurking around the castle. He was too lazy to go to the Dark Church to buy these things. Although the Dark Church was far ahead of the Holy Church in the research of these things, but it was easy to expose his identity. Moreover, with the identity of a primary alchemist of the Dark Church, it would be difficult to buy so many things at once. 100 pounds of each. Dudian said to the person behind the exchange desk. There was a young man behind the exchange desk. He took the items from Dudian's hand. He was stunned as he saw the items that Dudian had selected. 100 pounds of each? 1 pound? Dudian nodded. I'll come back tomorrow to buy more. The young man was speechless. People buy these things by gram, but Dudian was buying by weight? I'm sorry, sir. These things are limited in stock. If you want to buy 100 pounds, then you need to be a master-level authority. If you are buying for your teacher, then please show your teacher's medal. The young man restrained his curses as he maintained a polite euphemism. Dudian took out his epic medal. Can this be counted? The young man was startled as he saw the medal. His pupils shrank as he said in astonishment, Epic medal? This. He suddenly thought of something and asked, Are you Mr. Dean? Dudian was startled as he lowered his voice. Don't be so loud. The youth came back to his senses and saw Dean wearing a mask. He immediately knew what Dean meant. Embarrassed, he smiled and said, Sorry, I couldn't control myself. Please don't mind me. I didn't recognize you. I'm really sorry. You're welcome. I'm in a hurry. Give me the order. Dudian said. The young man quickly handed over the exchange order. After a moment, Dudian filled in the order form and handed it to the young man. The young man looked at the order form and saw the name Dudian. He knew that he wasn't mistaken. Although Dudian's face was covered but his voice was very young. There was only one person in the Temple of Elements who had won the epic medal at such a young age, and that was the young man in front of him. The young man carefully put away the order form and smiled. Mr. Dean, I'll do it for you now. Dudian nodded. Then I'll trouble you. I have other things to do. Goodbye. He waved goodbye and left. Dudian returned to his castle after leaving the Temple of Elements. He looked at the mailbox at the door and asked the temple staff who was standing next to the mailbox, Is there a letter from Dudian? The temple staff looked at him in surprise. Are you Mr. Dudian? There are so many letters that the mailbox can't fit all of them. I've taken them out and put them in another box. Dudian was startled. He thought that other people would write to him in addition to the temple. After all, he was a celebrity now. He immediately asked, Is there a letter from the temple? At this time, the staff of the temple came with a big box of letters. He seemed to be an ordinary person as he was tired and out of breath. Dudian was surprised as he saw the box full of letters. There were at least thousands of letters in it. He smiled bitterly and asked the staff to put the box down. After the staff left, he put the box in the room and didn't care about it. He first opened the letter in his hand and glanced at it. Sure enough, it was a letter informing him of his promotion to senior oracle. Dudian immediately put away the letter. He didn't look at the other letters on the ground as he went downstairs. He went all the way to the Apostle Castle to replace his medal. At the same time Dudian went to the Apostle Castle. Various consortia were discussing the purchase plan of Dudian's new invention. An urgent message was passed into the hands of the Holy Church and the highest authority of each consortium. What? Lost? Rudolph was shocked as he looked at the butler in front of him. How is it possible? We have been fighting with the barbarians for so many years, and we have never lost an entire fortress. How could they take it this time? Chapter 319. Damn! These barbarians have become so cunning. Rudolph's face was gloomy. Immediately send our informants to check the military's movements. Let's see how they choose. This time the barbarians broke into the fortress. They must have been planning for a long time. Also prepare the carriage. I'm going to the consortium for a meeting. Yes. The butler replied. In another room of the castle, there was a bedroom of hundreds of square meters. There was a large bed with a pink mosquito net. It was 5 meters long and 4 meters wide. The bed was padded with thick cotton velvet. The servants had to use a stick to make the bed. At the moment, a beautiful figure was sitting on the bed. She was using a pair of scissors to cut a card. There were 2 small figures on her feet. One was a man and the other was a woman. She was cutting a huge card in her hand. It looked like a castle building. On the other side of her hand was a law book. When she was tired, she would stop to rest and read the book. Mel family. In a luxurious office, a dark red carpet covered every corner of the room. The light golden curtains were decorated with hollow butterflies. The light from outside shone through the curtains onto the carpet. When the wind blew against the curtains, the butterflies seemed to be dancing on the carpet. All the decorations in the room exuded a sense of elegance and femininity. There used to be a portrait of a famous actress hanging on the ceiling of the room. Now it was replaced by a magnificent map. The map was square. It was the outline of the entire giant wall. The central area of the map was dark. The periphery was very small. It was sandwiched between the outer wall and the inner wall. It looked like a narrow sewage drain. There were 4 areas inside the map. In addition to the garbage dump, the other 3 areas were sequentially isolated. The drawing on the map was rather detailed. One could vaguely see the outlines of the buildings in each area, ranging from simple to prosperous. On the periphery of this area, there was an extremely small line and a black dot marking the symbol. Outside the symbol was a scarlet wasteland. Outside the wasteland was the outline of the giant wall. The 4 sides of the giant wall had a large number of color plates with small numbers written on them. Under this magnificent map sat a slender and delicate young lady. Her golden hair cascaded down her shoulders like a waterfall. Unlike the curly hair that most noble ladies liked, her hair was as straight as a pencil, and the bangs above her eyebrows were neatly cut. She was full of a capable and experienced temperament. She was dressed in dark red clothes with a black skirt on the outside. She was dressed elegantly like a lady. Her father used to sit in this position. Now she was sitting in this position. She was the young lady of the Mel family, Sarah Mel. "Miss, the king's fortress has been broken. Will the military dispatch the guards to encircle it?" A fair-skinned, big-eyed maid next to her asked in a low voice. She was dressed differently from ordinary maids. Her clothes were more neutral and full of heroic spirit. With her short brown hair, she looked like a slim and handsome young man at first glance. However, the bulging breasts in front of her chest betrayed her gender. Sarah Mel was sitting in a chair looking at the small map in front of her. She thoughtfully said, "If the guards are used here, then they will be able to force the barbarians to retreat. But the other fortresses will be attacked by the barbarians. The losses will be even greater. This is probably the first step of the barbarians' strategy. Barbarians don't have the environment to learn knowledge. How can they be so cunning?" The maid was puzzled. Sarah Mel slowly said, "We humans are born to attack. It's just like how beasts are born to hunt. In a long battle, if they don't grow, they would have been eliminated by us long ago. This time, they dared to invade during the day of blessing. The strategists among these savages are far smarter than we thought. I'm afraid this will be a long and drawn-out battle. Damn soldiers, they can't even defend a fortress." The maid didn't have much fear in her face as she saw her angry face. She just said in a worried tone, "If it is a protracted war, then the losses to our consortium will be too great. The position behind the king's fortress is the Red Maple Mountains. It is the mining area of our Melon consortium. After the barbarians capture the fortress, they are bound to occupy the Red Maple Mountains. The terrain there is dangerous. It is easy to defend but difficult to attack. It is very likely that it will be the first stronghold of the barbarians. Our consortium will fall into a disadvantageous position in the war against the Scott consortium." Sarah Mel looked up at her and smiled. "You didn't follow me for so long in vain. You have a good perception." The maid was startled. "It's all thanks to you, Mississippi," Sarah Mel smiled. "Then I'll take this opportunity to test you. What do you think we should do now?" The maid's eyes turned. "Miss, you said that the mining industry is a place that our consortium must fight for. It is also the foundation of Melon Consortium's financial resources. So we can't lose the Red Maple Mountains. So we can only find a way to help the military expel the barbarians. We can temporarily rent a large number of war supplies from the military to share the burden of the war. After the war is over, we will have time to collect the debt. Even if we can't collect the debt, the military will owe us a favor. In the future, our consortium will be more convenient than other consortiums." Sarah Mel couldn't help but smile. "You little devil, this idea is good." The maid's eyes lit up. It's all thanks to you, Mississippi. Sarah took back her eyes and said, the idea is good, but it's not feasible. Other consortiums can think of this method. The military can also think of it, so the effect is not great. Moreover, you underestimate the background of the military. If the time comes, they can immediately send the Imperial Guards to expel the barbarians and plug the gap in the fortress. The maid was startled. Then, why didn't the military act? If we let the barbarians ravage, then the reputation of the military. Lisa, you have to look at the long term. Just a little bit more and it will be enough. Sarah Mell's finger gently tapped on the table. Each of our consortiums, including the military, have to face more than one enemy. In this world, everyone is an enemy. You have to remember this sentence. Therefore, some cards can't be exposed until the critical moment. As for reputation, the eyes of the masses can see what we want them to see. Who knows what we don't want them to see? The heroic-looking maid called Lisa was startled. She lowered her head and said, Miss, you are smart. At least I am better than my brother. Sarah Mell's eyes flashed. He only knows how to work for the Holy Church. What is the use of being a knight of light? He is just a lackey of power. Lisa's face slightly changed. She didn't dare to say anything. Get ready. Uncle Rudolph should be impatient to hold a meeting to discuss how to solve the problem. The Red Maple Mine is the property of the Bourong family. If they lose it, then how will they be able to be on equal footing with our Mell family in the future? If it wasn't for Rudolph's short-sightedness, then the most talented architect in history, Dean, would have been a member of our consortium. At that time our consortium would unify the economic wealth outside the giant wall. Wouldn't it be a matter of time before we unify the wealth outside the giant wall? What a vulgar guy! Sarah Mell coldly snorted. Lisa nodded again and again. She secretly looked at Sarah Mell but didn't say anything. Temple of Elements. Apostle Castle. This was the place where architects who were below master level would receive orders. Dean showed his identity medal and entered the temple. He went through a series of procedures and finally received his senior architect medal. He also got an additional production fund of up to 50,000 gold coins. Although this amount of money wasn't much for him, the price of the lightning rod could reach more than 500,000 gold coins. But as a bonus it was extremely high. In addition to the bonus, he was transferred to a new castle. There was a separate research room. He didn't have to worry about being disturbed by the people next door or upstairs or downstairs. Dean took the things back to his room. He hired a staff to pack up all the letters on the ground. He took his other tools and left the place. He met other people in the castle. They saw Dean's outfit and knew that he was ready to move out. They were envious of him. A few of them wanted to take the opportunity to build a good relationship with him. They wanted to pave the way for the future, but Dean politely refused. Dean came to the 13th castle according to the instructions. He saw a familiar figure at the door. The latter also saw him and was startled. After a long time he squeezed out a stiff smile. I heard that you are promoted to senior architect. Congratulations. Tiffany didn't expect that she would meet the boy again so soon. The last time they had argued in the temple, she had failed. Later on, she thought that the crossbow was a blasphemy against her master's work. Not only did it surpass her proudest work, but it also surpassed her master's tri-star snake crossbow. This matter had a deep impact on her. But the most profound thing was that the boy had said, "The best way to pay respect is to surpass others." For this reason, she put aside her thoughts and painstakingly studied her own divine incantation. However, when she had just entered the final stage of her divine incantation, she found that the other party had once again created a great uproar. He had produced an even more outstanding work. Moreover, it was a cross-discipline work, and he had become one of the few dual-discipline divine incantation users. Moreover, because of this work, he had reached the status of a senior oracle and was on an equal footing with her. What was even more unexpected was that the other party had actually been assigned to the same castle as her. Dean didn't expect to meet this woman here. But it was a trivial matter for him. He smiled. I didn't expect to see you here. Are we going to be neighbors in the future? Tiffany's heart relaxed as she saw Dean's relaxed smile. She didn't know how to respond if Dean was going to pursue the matter. However, it seemed that Dean didn't care about the past. Tiffany smiled. I was in the 9th castle, but now I have moved here. I didn't expect such a coincidence. If you need any help in the future, just tell me. All right. Dean smiled. Senior architects were people with a wide network. It was better to have one more friend than one more enemy. Tiffany saw the staff of the temple behind Dean holding a huge bag. You have just arrived. Which building? I'll take you there. It's all right. I'll find it myself. Don't mention it. I don't need this. Tiffany smiled. Dean didn't refuse anymore. He told Tiffany the temple's number and followed Tiffany to complete the check-in procedures. He gave the key to the previous room to the staff of the temple and asked them to hand it over to the temple. Dean casually glanced at the floors of the building after saying goodbye to Tiffany. He saw some scattered furnishings, but he was too lazy to tidy them up. For him, this was just a temporary foothold. His goal was to reach higher. Dusk. Dean saw the servant of the Ryan family standing in the hall waiting for him when he returned to the castle. The servant saw Dean and immediately came forward to greet him. Dean went out of the hall and returned to the Ryan castle with the servant. 2 hours later, Dean appeared on the 2nd floor of the Ryan castle. Sander was also present in the study room of the old patriarch. I've just heard about it. Old Fulin lowered his voice. The king's fortress has been broken. I heard that it was broken this morning. The barbarians should have marched to the Red Maple Mountains behind the fortress. If the military moves fast enough, then they can stop them before they enter the Red Maple Mountains. But if they are slow, then it will be a long war. The surprise on Dean's face receded a little bit. His eyes flashed slightly. He frowned and pondered. Is the Red Maple Mountains ownerless? Or does it belong to a consortium? It's the territory of the Mellon family. Old Fulin replied. Dean was startled and lost in thought. Old Fulin and Sander looked at each other. They didn't make a sound as they waited for the youth. Dean looked up. How much do you know about the barbarians? Old Fulin and Sander were startled. Old Fulin said, Do you want to help? This isn't something we can intervene in. The barbarians are extremely fierce. They are led by military counselors. They are brave and good at fighting. Their physique is far stronger than our soldiers. Moreover, there are some crazy blood barbarians among them. They have amazing physique and are as terrifying as hunters. Moreover, their strength is greatly increased when they are enraged. They are like beasts and are extremely difficult to deal with. Dean's eyes slightly moved as he pondered. After a moment he stood up. We will pay attention to this matter for a few days. The Mellon Consortium is bound to keep an eye on our recent actions. You don't need to do anything. I will handle it. Old Fulin looked at him and nodded. I'll leave it to you. Dean nodded slightly, put on his coat and turned to leave. Old Fulin wanted to send him downstairs but was stopped by Dean. Let Uncle Sander send me. You should go back and rest. Old Fulin's eyes saw the servants in the hall. He hesitated for a moment but nodded. Dean told the coachman to go to a nearby hotel after leaving the Ryan family. It's too late. I won't go back to sleep tonight. I'll rest here. He opened 2 rooms, one for the coachman and the other for himself. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.